You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm joined by Knox Peden, a visiting fellow at the Center for Early Modern Studies at the ANU, who has researched and written extensively on modern thought in Europe. He's here to explore a word that, at least in this context, has nothing to do with either street lamps or the candelabra from Beauty and the Beast. Lumière. I'm super excited to welcome Knox Peden to the podcast. Knox, welcome. Could you please let our listeners know a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Hi, Emily. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on the show. Well, I've done a lot of things over the past decade or so since I got my PhD, but I've written a fair bit about the history of French philosophy and French thought. And in that context, I've written a lot about the legacy of the Enlightenment and certain thinkers that are associated with that movement, especially a guy named Spinoza, who wasn't French, but was really popular with a lot of French thinkers and unpopular with others. So I published a bit on his influence and the way other French philosophers have sort of taken him up. I've also taught a fair bit. I've taught history of philosophy. I've taught intellectual history. And most recently, for a couple of years, I taught a seminar on European Enlightenments at the University of Queensland here in Australia in their honors program in Western civilization. And through that time, I've gotten to spend a fair bit of time in Paris and really love the city and really kind of love everything about French culture and French intellectual life and have enjoyed studying it and writing about it. So that's a little bit about me.
Awesome. And so I'm really excited to have you on. I mean, A, just because I think we're going to have a fun conversation, but B, because I think you're the perfect person to talk to us a little bit about this really essential part of French thought that has, I think, continued to have repercussions and continue to be perceptible in French culture today, which is this Enlightenment era that you spent so much time thinking about. One of the myths that I'm excited to debunk, basically, is I think a lot of people come to Paris and they call it the City of Light or the City of Lights with an S at the end. And when they say the word light, they think about, the pretty lampposts or maybe like the advent of gaslighting, which not gaslighting, not, emotional harassment, but gas lighting, the lighting of street gas.
Right. So there's a different connotation these days. Yeah.
I know. Gosh. Now we're going to have to debunk so many myths. But Paris was one of the first cities to have actual lighting by gas of the streets, which meant that we had lower incidences of crime. But the pretty pink light that Paris is known for is not actually the light that we're talking about when we call Paris the City of Light. So do you know sort of when we started calling Paris the City of Light? And was that linked to philosophy or was that linked to gas lighting?
Well, the association of the city of Paris with the concept of light or with, the French word lumière, because, when you first reached out to me, you said, this is sort of the key word we're going to talk about is lumière and its place in sort of French culture and intellectual history. And of course, my first thought when I heard that was not the Enlightenment, but I might be dating myself a little bit, but my introduction to the French word lumière was the candelabra in Disney's Beauty and the Beast was named Lumière.
No, I must be the same age because I thought about that too.
Yeah, I just, so the word has a very strong meaning for me. But no, this idea of lights or lumière is very much associated with this movement or moment or whatever you want to call it. It's obviously very contested in 18th century France called the Enlightenment. In English, we call it the Enlightenment. In German, they say Aufklärung, which translates as sort of more like enlightenment in the sense of like clarifying, like, bringing something to light, making something clearer. But in France, you hear a lot of references to the 18th century being the siècle des Lumières, like the century of lights or of enlightenment. Now, one of the things that's interesting is in the late 17th century, Paris was, in fact, the first city to begin to illuminate its streets, as you indicated. And, as with a lot of things in history and cultural history and intellectual history, you can get in these kind of chicken or the egg arguments with like, was the intellectual movement first and then it had these kind of social effects, or did something change in society or technology? And then all the thinkers started talking about it. And this is a good example because, Paris did start to be illuminated, and through the kind of wealth and prestige of all the stuff that was going on in the kind of absolutist era, there were the kind of the resources to start doing this. But around that same time, you have these intellectual movements that are kind of trying to conquer these regions of darkness, right? These kind of heretofore obscure aspects of the human experience or of nature or whatnot, and sort of bringing those areas to light. So just as, the night becomes this place that we can finally kind of start to, explore or colonize or whatever, maybe a little bit of a fraught term, but sort of, take over with our technological advancements, with lighting, with things like street lighting. Likewise, these thinkers sort of think, well, let's branch out. Let's kind of get into different kinds of terrain. And obviously, in doing that, they begin to encroach on areas that were typically in the remit of the church or royal authority or things like that. So there's kind of a crash course set up by this effort to kind of explore new things and take some of the developments in the scientific revolution and apply them to social or political or human questions. So that as kind of a first pass, I think you kind of have both. You have Paris being illuminated, but yes, you do have the siècle des Lumières as a sort of century of lights. And a lot of the thinkers associated kind of thought of themselves as, promoting this idea that it's the century of lights.
And for those of our listeners who, unlike a French high school student, which is one of my favorite things ever, takes philosophy as a mandatory class in school. So for our listeners who may be Anglophones, who might have a passing understanding of the Enlightenment, who might have heard a couple of names like Voltaire get thrown around, in the world of Cliff's Notes, which I know for academics is very, very hard. But if you could sort of Cliff's Notes, sort of sum up, who are the major players in France in this movement and what are sort of the governing principles? What would be their elevator pitch if they encountered a stranger, pre-elevators, of course, to try and sell them on Enlightenment? What do you sort of think the major players and the governing principles of the Enlightenment era are?
Well, you already named one. One of the major heavy hitters is Voltaire. And also going back to like 90s movies, although I guess Beauty and the Beast is 89. But I remember I had heard the name Voltaire before, but I didn't really know he was associated with the Enlightenment until I saw the movie Swingers. And there's a scene where the character is told he can order breakfast anytime. And he says, well, I'd like pancakes in the age of enlightenment. And then the woman serving him says, take it easy, Voltaire, or something like that. So there's a kind of funny association like between the Enlightenment and Voltaire, even in a kind of 90s indie movie. But anyway, I digress. So Voltaire is one of the major thinkers. He was born Francois Arouet was his name. And he came from not nobility, but he came from a pretty, not impoverished background or anything. And like a lot of precocious French students, he was educated by Jesuits and in the church, but he had this kind of voracious intellectual appetite. He started writing poetry, and he started writing histories, and he started kind of infusing everything he was writing with this kind of ribald, kind of satirical voice. And so one of the things that's really important about the Enlightenment is that, especially in the French context, it really recognizes no sacred cows and is the beginning of a very kind of modern disposition to kind of treat everything ironically or critically and kind of make light of things. So Voltaire wrote a number of great works, but one of the most famous is his short novella titled Candide, which is the story of this young naif who kind of travels all over the world. And he's been educated by this philosophy professor who tells him that, the only coherent philosophy is optimism. Everything is always for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Meanwhile, this whole story is with these horrible things happening. There's earthquakes, towns are razed to the ground. There's rape, there's pillage, there's everything. And the young naif is sort of like, I guess everything's for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Like, how are we supposed to kind of live in this context? And so it's a satire of this kind of philosophical optimism that thinks a providential God is going to always take care of everything. But the conclusion of that book is actually quite significant as a kind of credo for the Enlightenment, because after all these horrible things have happened to all these people, Candide kind of reconnects with some of the friends he's met along the way at the end of the book. And the professor tries to tell him a little bit more about how everything is as it's supposed to be and gets very high-minded. And Candide's like, yeah, that's all well and good, but I think we should just cultivate our garden. And this idea that the best you can kind of do in this world is cultivate your garden is very much a French Enlightenment idea. Now, it's a little bit different in the German context or the Scottish context. It's very much a French Enlightenment idea. So that's an idea strongly associated with Voltaire. The other names that might be vaguely familiar to some people are Montesquieu, who wrote a text called The Spirit of the Laws. And if any American history buffs are listening, they'll know that was a really important text for the founding fathers of the U.S., especially about the separation of powers in government. He also wrote one of my favorite books of all time, Persian Letters, which is one of the, not the first epistolary novels, but is a very important epistolary novel in the context of the Enlightenment. And then other thinkers would be like Diderot, D'Alembert. You'll notice that I'm only naming men. A lot of the famous Enlightenment authors are men, but one of the other interesting things about the Enlightenment as a moment is how important the salons of Paris were as kind of patronage networks for allowing these ideas to disseminate. And a lot of very important women had roles in managing these sort of salons. But that's just maybe, a subject for another conversation about how that kind of all played out. But the kind of heavy hitters of the Enlightenment are, I would say, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot. And then there's a controversial figure, who is sometimes considered, epitome of the Enlightenment, but others consider him the great enemy of the Enlightenment or the beginning of counter-Enlightenment. And this is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is, in fact, not French. He is from Geneva. He's Swiss, and, they claim him. But Rousseau had some interesting things to say against the kind of Enlightenment embrace of reason is kind of the main way to guide our conduct. And he was really more interested in advancing a new kind of way of thinking about the way our passions inform our choices, inform us, and sort of shape the kind of people we turn out to be. So anyway, that's just kind of a survey of some of the major themes and thinkers associated with it.
Yeah, and Rousseau, total aside and possible urban legend, so take this with a grain of salt, but I always heard that even though Rousseau, so he's Swiss, he's buried in the Pantheon, which is devoted to the great French men and like 6 French women. And apparently he's buried in such a way that his head is within the Pantheon, but his feet are outside of it because his feet belong to Switzerland, but his head belongs to France. But that's, again, possibly urban legend. But I like the story.
It's a good story, yeah. I thought you were going to say some other worse things. There's some real dirt on Rousseau about, dragging his kids to the orphanage and stuff like that. So
yeah, a lot of these guys were not super nice, but
no.
Yeah.
And yet they like to theorize, how we should behave in a republic or things like that.
Oh, man. Yeah. So you brushed up against some super interesting points that I definitely want to delve deeper into. For those who are interested in hearing more about those salons that you were talking about in an earlier episode with Anne Marcella, I will drop it in the show notes. We talked a little bit about those salons. So if you're interested in hearing a little bit more about some of the influential women of this time, be it regarding Enlightenment or freer love, pre the 60s free love, definitely tune into that episode. And then there's another element of French culture that I've discussed on this podcast before with Lindsay Tremuda. So I'll put that link in the show notes as well. But I do want to talk more about it now, which is laïcité. So laïcité is this French approach to secularism. France is very proudly laïque, so very proudly secular with a very firm separation of church and state. But we have this sort of intermingling of church symbolism in the Enlightenment era. But at the same time, when we were prepping this episode, you were quite clear with me that the French Enlightenment is actually and this is the way that you put it, in its self-understanding, hostile to the church. So I'm really interested to hear a little bit about how the Enlightenment navigates this very present, massive church power at the time that it's sort of coming to be in France.
That's right. Yeah. The simplest way to state it before academics come along and try to make the thesis more subtle and everything is that, yeah, the French Enlightenment was anti-clerical in its essence, really. I mentioned "Cultivate your garden" as a slogan from Voltaire. The more pugnacious slogan he would often close his letters with this, was "Écraser l'infâme," so crush infamy. And infamy was the Roman Catholic Church. That's what he was talking about as an institution. So that's not very subtle as an idea, I guess. But this is interesting, and again, a kind of ongoing contested space, because I don't know, some of your readers, when they've heard about the Enlightenment, I found this always with my students, is when you start teaching them about the Enlightenment, there's a whole cohort of the class that for whom the term has immediately almost a kind of like Buddhist connotation or something, like achieving enlightenment or something, that like through meditation one would become enlightened or something. So you see this term in a lot of different contexts. But those who do know that at some sort of moment in the advent of European modernity, they might have heard the term bandied about by a group that was really popular about 10 years ago, these thinkers called the New Atheists. Yet again, strangely, all men kind of arguing about these things, people like Christopher Hitchens or Dan Dennett or Sam Harris and stuff like that. And this idea was taken up by a Harvard psychologist named Steven Pinker, who actually published a book called Enlightenment Now, which sounds a little bit like Serenity Now, from Seinfeld or something. But he was calling for Enlightenment Now. And it was this kind of unapologetic defense of science and quantitative reasoning against anything that smacked of mysticism or a kind of religious kind of orientation to the world.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Don't Miss This, which will clue you into some of the most interesting events happening in Paris right now. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French.
So this idea that enlightenment is a slogan that is against religion or against kind of inherited tradition or things like that is very much like kind of part of the legacy of this moment. And, the kind of association of enlightenment with modernity. But one of the things that I always think is interesting about this move is like, as a self-branding exercise, it's very effective. And if you think about a term like modernity is a kind of a surrogate term for enlightenment, is like, the moderns know better than the ancients or something like that. Like, we all know that we live in the modern world. We have a sense of being modern. Well, it's not like people that lived in the ancient world say, hey, we're really ancient. I can't wait for like modernity to get here. Or that people in like the Middle Ages thought of themselves in a middle period, or much less in the Dark Ages or something like that. So the Enlightenment is kind of the beginning of this like rewriting history itself to be the story of this kind of secular emancipation from tradition and these inherited practices, which not coincidentally are all associated with the church and with Christendom. And like the kind of Christendom is this defining kind of feature of the space of Europe, And that's the thing, I think that in the modern age, you mentioned laïcité, where religion has been privatized to the extent that there's a public space from which it is excluded. That makes it very hard for us to think historically about what it was like to live in the world where that wasn't just not the case, but truly unthinkable, right? The idea that Christianity or your beliefs or anything, like this whole aspect of your being would be like cordoned off somewhere. Like that's just not the way things were. And if you like try to kind of import that way of thinking into an earlier period, you're gonna have trouble understanding what people in that moment actually thought. So understand like sort of why they were so anti-clerical. I mean, there are a lot of reasons. I mean, one is like the actual corruption in the church, things like that. Similarly with like the Reformation, you want to explain the Reformation, you have to explain like what is actually going on in the church as a human institution at this time and sort of why things are sort of coming under attack. But one of the interesting things about the French context is that because the Reformation doesn't really succeed in displacing the Catholic Church as the kind of predominant site of Christianity in France. I mean, you do have like Calvinist sects and sort of things like that, little groups moving around. But, France remains a Catholic country. Henry IV says, Paris is worth a mass. Nonetheless, have this kind of infighting within Catholicism. Like you have this group that I'm actually quite interested in now and hoping to write sort of a history of. They're called the Jansenists, and I won't go into why they're called that. But the bottom line is they kind of got at crosshairs with both Rome and the crown at the same time. So the crown and Rome kind of united against them, but they claimed to be like more Catholic than Rome and kind of started defining a kind of Gallican, by which I mean, French kind of separate Catholicism at this moment. And you have a whole history of a kind of Gallicanism, which would be like analogous with Anglicanism in England or something like that. So you already have this kind of breaking up of the edifice that is taking place in a religious context. And a lot of these people educated the guys that would go on to be the Enlightenment thinkers. So as a lot of things in history, you have this moment where the thing that actually turns out to be the exit from some sort of institutional arrangement, in this case, like official Christendom or the Catholic Church, all of that effort kind of actually starts within that institution. And so they kind of start chipping away at this kind of edifice. But one of the other interesting things about this is that the French thinkers that go on to, criticize the church and criticize ultimately the crown, although not all of them do. A lot of them actually advocate for something that historians call enlightened absolutism, which is this idea that, like, we tend to associate the Enlightenment with democracy, or at least someone like Steven Pinker does. But someone like Voltaire was really happy to go advise Frederick the Great in Prussia and tell him how to be an enlightened monarch, and sort of take better care of his people. But what's interesting about all these people, all these thinkers, is that they actually hold positions outside of government, right? And so they don't really get their hands dirty, like in politics. And if you get on Twitter today or basically read anything online, you'll see that it's really easy to like criticize what states do when you're not part of their governing apparatus. Like when you're on the outside, it's really easy to like kind of throw stones. So like, Voltaire is the original like subtweeter, like sort of troll, it's really easy to kind of attack these institutions. So that's part of it. The other part of it, sort of intellectually, is that Christian theology, whether it was in its Catholic guise or some sort of Protestant guise, was in a period of sort of massive reorganization in light of the discoveries of the scientific revolution. Like really just, basic stuff like, discovering that the earth went around the sun, and discovering that the planet had these other continents on it that we didn't really know about. And that complicated like the whole understanding of human history. And so there was all this kind of reorientation of how you're going to understand these kind of foundational narratives that European civilization had really been built on. And what a lot of the thinkers wind up opting for is not a total kind of rejection of religion or rejection of God, but something called deism. Deism is the belief that there is a God, but that God kind of made the world, inflicted it into motion, and then has nothing to do with it now. So we can kind of carry on, do our thing, and it's not like God is here or going to have anything to do with us. And that's to be contrasted with something called theism, which is basically what all the great monotheisms are theisms. They believe that there is a God and that God can still intervene in the world in some sort of way. So Voltaire was a deist. Montesquieu was, but more than anything kind of didn't care. Like a lot of his thinking is bound up with the idea that this stuff is kind of irrelevant. Let's think about other things. And this is to be contrasted with a thinker like Diderot, who was neither a deist nor a theist, but was really one of the first thinkers that we would call today a materialist. Like he really did think that all there was to the world was atoms, bits of matter kind of bumping into each other. And he wrote these kind of great reveries about like how emancipating this was to sort of think this way. But, Diderot has a lot of fans and apologists. But I personally think there's kind of a current of sadness kind of going through some of his work when you realize that this is all it is or something like that. And all you really have are these kind of intense experiences that you can kind of try to celebrate. So Diderot wrote a lot of playful texts and dialogue sort of exploring this idea. But then the other thing that Diderot was really associated with was another kind of defining element of the French Enlightenment, which was the encyclopédie. I know I just mangled that and said that in both French and English, but encyclopédie or encyclopedia, which was this kind of effort that Diderot conducted with his friend Jean-Laurent d'Alembert to kind of take all of the world's knowledge and put it in one place, right? And one of the really interesting things that they did was the church, whatever else it taught, definitely taught a hierarchy of knowledges, where the highest knowledge was the knowledge of God and lowest knowledge was kind of knowledge of basic things of nature, and sort of in the middle was humanity. But the encyclopedia had this very flat structure where the arrangement was alphabetical, which basically amounts to being arbitrary, right? There's no hierarchy of knowledge. There's just things in a list. And they had a lot of fun with it too. Like in the entry, on the Eucharist, they said like also see cannibalism or something. The idea that you're like eating a body or something like this. So again, that's an example of a kind of Enlightenment playfulness. But yeah, so I hope that it addresses a little bit of what you were asking about the kind of relationship to laïcité and these kinds of things.
No, absolutely. And in that extremely deep sort of approach to that entangled kind of web of the chicken and egg scenario, you brushed up against another thing that I'm interested in sort of delving into with you, which is obviously these things don't exist just in history. And part of the thing that I love talking about on this podcast is the way in which these sort of historic ideas guide us to a France that is quite modern and contemporary. And I mean, you addressed a little bit of that sort of irony, that playfulness, that doublespeak that we find a lot in French humor. That means that even 15 years after having moved here, I still sometimes like the jokes go right over my head. And I'm curious, knowing what you know about the France of the Enlightenment era and modern France, are there elements of the Enlightenment era values or philosophies that you think are still quite palpable or perceptible in French culture and French sort of reasoning or thought today?
Yeah, I do. I mean, indeed, I think that one of the peculiar features of the Enlightenment legacy in the French context, as opposed to some of the other Enlightenments, the German Enlightenment associated with someone like the philosopher Immanuel Kant, or the Scottish Enlightenment, which is associated with someone like Adam Smith, who's really important for sort of modern arguments about free trade and economics. In the French Enlightenment, it's like you have this kind of this anti-clerical element, but I mentioned this idea of enlightened absolutism. You have the idea still of kind of like philosopher kings, like that, like really smart people who do a lot of writing should like be able to kind of run things and like, manage the state. And it's interesting because it's like the Enlightenment often gets associated with a kind of modern democratic idea, like the advance of human rights, the advance of democracy, like all these things. But like the French Enlightenment wasn't necessarily very democratic. It's like, and in a way it was kind of, statist in the sense that it like really thought that, the authority, once it kind of understood how human nature worked by reading the encyclopedia or something, should be able to kind of manage things really well, and that you should kind of trust the state to do that. So what's interesting, I mean, there's one way to think about this is how the meaning of the Enlightenment changes as a result of the French Revolution, because the meme kind of is that the Enlightenment caused the French Revolution, and people that really love the French Revolution and love the Enlightenment are really happy to celebrate that. And people that think that the French Revolution went kind of pear-shaped, sorry to use a Aussie expression there, but hopefully your listeners will understand what I mean, to go pear-shaped. Reign of Terror, that's not too good. Napoleon, not, let's just say, ambivalent. If the Enlightenment helped generate that, then the Enlightenment sort of has something to answer for, right? That like why all these things could kind of result in a kind of terrifying way. And part of the story there, I think, has to do with a thesis that it's from a pretty old book from the 30s by an American scholar named Carl Becker, called The Heavenly City of the 18th Century Philosophers. And it's the title is being kind of impish, being kind of funny. And it's, the book's been criticized, but it's kind of, I think, having a resurgence right now as an argument. But the idea is that these Enlightenment thinkers all thought that they were getting away from religion, but they remained very providential in their outlook. They thought history had a meaning, and that history was going towards some final end that was going to be really, really great. Just it wasn't the final end that Christianity was talking about. It was a final end that was going to be achieved kind of by human action, armed with the most sort of state-of-the-art knowledge. And you can see how that can sound good, but you can also imagine other situations where that doesn't go well. Like, so for a lot of thinkers, something like 20th century communism is very much related to the Enlightenment. Karl Marx himself was inspired by all the Enlightenment thinkers, So this idea that humans can kind of take it in their hands and create their own destiny, and that'll be really, really good. And that the kind of task of politics is to achieve a kind of emancipated final end where everything will be great sort of in this world. And so I think that in contemporary France, you can kind of see two legacies of the Enlightenment in the idea that the state is supposed to be the kind of agent that will accomplish that. So the state itself is like really empowered to kind of bring these things forward. And the kind of ongoing rivalry to the church or to Christianity as the kind of schema that can give meaning to people's lives, basically. So like that's the whole point about all the significance of all these national symbols, or the things that comes out of the French Revolution, like the Marianne, or the kind of, they set up this cult of the supreme being that they were going to celebrate on Sundays because they realized people didn't know what they were doing on Sundays anymore. And all the kind of like modern national symbols, what people call civic religion, which is very much an idea associated with Rousseau, that it's like, it doesn't matter what religion you have, just as long as you have one. So let's have a civic religion, and all these kind of national symbols, and right down to the tricolore, like the flag, and all these things you kind of get behind, have this kind of religious tenor. But again, the reality is that that's not something that has superseded Christianity or the Catholic Church, because obviously the Catholic Church is still there, even if it's quite embattled. And we all know that like the numbers tell the story about the kind of collapse of institutional Christianity in Europe in terms of like believers or people actually doing it. But it's still there, And a lot of the debates, I think, that you see in France today are really kind of bound up with this kind of conflicted history.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Romancing in Paris, which delves into love, lust, and so much more in the City of Light. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French.
One of the things I find, I think, kind of troubling is you do see a kind of reclamation of Catholicism or something on the French right, but you have a lot of thinkers or a lot of people in that space that sort of reclaim Catholicism purely culturally, like without the content, like without the beliefs. And they're like, oh, but it's like important to kind of reclaim this idea, which is very kind of weird, like kind of contrary to what those beliefs ought to be, and is something that would only make sense after the Enlightenment, when you can think of religion as just being something like a culture. You know what I mean? So it's like a very kind of, if you're trying to reclaim Catholicism to combat the Enlightenment, you're actually doing a very Enlightenment move on Catholicism and thinking of it as a culture that you can use to like accomplish your goals. So it's kind of like, you can see how these things get really kind of confused. But I hope that it sort of speaks to a little bit of some of the kind of the currency and how these kind of, this tension is still very, very much alive in contemporary France.
Oh, absolutely. And I think we saw that really clearly with the fire at Notre Dame, for example, the sort of element that you're talking about of that being a cultural heritage almost divorced from its sort of Catholicness.
Exactly. Like there were some Catholics that were like, oh, it's just the church. It's like, what? It's like, it was more like the secular French were like treated it more as like a, this very, this like symbol of France. But if you think about it, that's quite ironic, right? Like with what France stands for, to have like literally the most visible landmark at the center of the city is, the church, the Cathedral of Our Lady. That's France for you right there. And this kind of like appropriation of inherited forms and kind of like repurposing them, right? And like the idea that like, okay, well, whatever was true in this is something that human reason will figure out and then like be able to kind of recuperate or, use in some sort of different way. So yeah, I think that's still there. Yeah.
Wow. Well, I know we've just scratched the surface of this. Do you have any book projects that you're working on now or that you've previously published where people can read a little bit more if they're interested in learning more about both French and European Enlightenment?
Oh, in terms of stuff I've done, I did write a chapter titled Knowledge there's a big project that just came out. Bloomsbury's published this kind of cultural history of the modern age, or cultural history of ideas in the modern age. It's too bad. I'll send you the link. We can put it in the show notes so that I can get the title exactly right. But I think it's the cultural history of ideas. And the volume I'm in is one for the modern age. And I wrote a chapter on knowledge. And I sort of talk about understanding the history of knowledge in the 20th century as a kind of referendum on the Enlightenment, sort of all a debate about the legacy of the Enlightenment. So I could send you a link to that project and people can access that. Hopefully a lot of libraries will have it. You can just read that short little chapter. In terms of my own work, I have become quite interested in this heterodox movement I refer to, the Jansenists, because I think that they're a kind of underappreciated moment in the history of ethics, and not just religious ethics, but sort of modern secular ethics. And there's a lot of interesting things about them. Some thinkers that your listeners may have heard of associated with this movement is someone like Blaise Pascal or the dramatist Jean Racine. They were both Jansenists. But there were also these wonderful nuns like Mère Angélique who wrote these really sort of amazing texts associated with this movement. So I am interested in writing a history of Jansenism that kind of brings into dialogue what, for lack of a better word, we call secular intellectual history with kind of religious or, an intellectual history that deals with what's going on in the church. One of the kind of encouraging things that's happening in the space in which I work is a lot more scholars are realizing that divide is kind of artificial if you're trying to understand the history, that you really do have to understand, especially in the French context, how much this stuff was all kind of intercalated. So yeah, that's something I'm working on now. But yeah, it'll be a long time before anyone will see any of that.
Well, we'll drop your link and your social media profiles in the show notes, so anybody who wants to keep abreast with the updated publishing schedule can stay in touch with your work. And I so very much appreciate you coming on the show today. Before I let you go, I only have one more question for you, and that is, what is your favorite word in French?
Oh, I mean, the first one that comes to mind is poubelle, obviously.
Oh, that's a good one.
And your listeners can look it up. So,
yeah, you can Google that one. It's not a bad word, I promise. It's totally PG, but have a little Google. Amazing. Well, Knox, thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.
Likewise. Thanks, Emily.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.